You're watching BBC News at the headlines now at midnight. Tonight, one of the world's most wanted men, the Bosnian Serb war crime suspect Radovan Karadzic, has been arrested by security services in Serbia.
He's evaded capture for over 12 years after being indicted for genocide during the Bosnian War by the International War Crimes Tribunal.
It's believed he's being held tonight at this court in Belgrade. His capture, announced on Serbian TV, brings reaction from around the world. America calls his arrest a tribute to the victims of atrocities. Good evening. The Bosnian Serb war crimes suspect Radovan Karadzic has been arrested by security services in Serbia. He's evaded capture for more than 12 years since he was indicted for genocide during the Bosnian War by the International War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague.
Well, he's accused of leading the slaughter of thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Croats. The UN says his forces killed at least 7,500 Muslim men and boys from Srebrenica in July 1995. He was also charged over the shelling of Sarajevo and the use of UN peacekeepers as human shields in 1995. After the Dayton Accord that ended the Bosnian War, the former nationalist president went into hiding.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to the former EU High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Paddy Ashdown.
We chased him for 4 years while I was in Bosnia, over the hills and mountains and through the forests. So if he's been caught at last, I'm completely delighted. That's a very, very important act. Tremendously good news for Serbia. It's an act of closure for them and will enable Serbia, under its new pro-Western President Boris Tadic, who I suspect has had a big hand in this, to move forward towards Europe. It means, I think I heard the voice of my old friend Haris Salajic earlier on. It means, as he said, I think, a relief in Bosnia, an act of justice at last. And I think it means an act of justice for the world at large. I mean, he was, or at least will be accused of being, the perpetrator, principal architect of the worst acts of criminality and war crimes since the end of the Second World War. So good news on all fronts.
Why do you think he's managed to remain at large for so long?
Well, there's a very simple reason for that. It's often said that, NATO had so many forces there they couldn't catch him. But it wasn't NATO who didn't try, it was the Serbs. In the end, he was hidden by the Serbs. In the end, he could only be caught with the cooperation of the Serbs, and that's the way he's been caught in the end, as many of us believed he would be. I'm a little surprised he's been caught in Serbia. I suspected that he was hiding, probably being protected by the Serb Orthodox Church in the mountains of Montenegro. But if he's been caught by the Serb authorities in Serbia, my guess is probably quite close to the Bosnian border, knowing the area reasonably well, then that is very good news. It's not just good news he's being caught, because you can't have peace without justice, and this was the primary act of justice that we needed. But good news because it means that the Serbs themselves have decided to cooperate fully with the International Criminal Tribunal, and that, I think, is excellent news for the Balkans.
Well, yes, we heard from an EU spokesman about this being a positive move towards the EU for Serbia.
Undoubtedly. I mean, my own criticism is that well, more than a small way, both the European Union and NATO have somewhat relaxed the pressure on the Serbs to do this. But it seems that in the end, that's the pressure that's worked. And I think that's very good news.
What impact do you think his trial will have on that region?
Well, it will have an immense impact. I mean, I gave evidence against Milosevic, which had an impact, but not a very good one in Serbia, because Milosevic was regarded as something of a hero and standard using the television cameras to his people at home, although I think the case against him was pretty well proven. I think times have moved on. It'll be easier to prove the case against Karadzic, and I suspect nowadays most Serbs, both in the Republika Srpska in Bosnia and in Serbia proper, will want to put the past behind them. So I think the days have gone when Karadzic and his co-conspirator Ratko Mladic, who is of course still free, could actually prevent progress in the Balkans. But they could certainly slow it up, and it will mean that progress towards Europe and towards stability will come much more quickly.
How long do you think now before Mladic turns up?
Well, my guess was always that as I said, that Karadzic was being protected by the Serb Orthodox Church, Ratko Mladic by the renegade elements of the Serb security services. And if they've managed to catch Karadzic, I think that means a change of mood in Belgrade and in Serbia. And if it is true that Mladic is being protected by, as I said, renegade elements of the Serb security services, army and intelligence services, then his days must be numbered as well. There were, when I went to Bosnia in 2002, some 15 outstanding indictees. While I was there, we managed to get 13 of those and get them to The Hague. The two outstanding ones were Karadzic and Mladic. If Karadzic is now on his way to The Hague, which I hope he is, then that leaves one person left, and that's Mladic. And I just thought then it's only a matter of time. Mladic is said to be rather ill. He's said to have a bad heart complaint. But my guess is that his days of freedom should now be, drawing to a close. I'm glad to say. Great act of closure, great act of justice, and there'll be many, many weeping, bereaved mothers, daughters, sons, and others who will be very glad indeed that the perpetrator of these acts has finally been brought to justice.
When you were in Bosnia, what reaction did his name get from people that you met?
It depends where it came from. As it happens, I'm flying out to Bosnia by an early morning plane tomorrow, so I'll be interested to see my old friends and find out how they feel. I suspect that all Bosniak Muslims who suffered so terribly in this war will be celebrating. I suspect there will be jubilation in Sarajevo tomorrow. I suspect that there will be some recidivist elements of the Serbs who will see that their hero is gone and will be pretty gloomy about it. But most ordinary people amongst the great nation of Serbs will be relieved that the past is now being put behind them and they've got a future they can begin to work towards.
And that was Lord Paddy Ashdown talking to us a little bit earlier. Now we can talk to the BBC's former correspondent in the Balkans, Alan Little. Alan, maybe you could sum this up for us in first of all, telling us just how important it is that Radovan Karadzic has been arrested.
Well, it's part of a very important process which is now very well advanced, in which the Serb nation, if you like, and especially Serbia, the Republic of Serbia itself, are reinventing themselves, turning their back on that very dark period in their history. A lot of Serb war criminals have been tried not by the International Court, but by Serbia's own judiciary. That is a tremendous step forward in terms of the Serb nation reconciling itself to its own past, holding up a mirror and examining really for the first time the crimes that were committed in its name, because the awkward thing for Serbia is that for 10 years, when Milosevic was waging his wars in neighboring republics, Serbian public opinion, with some very honorable and important exceptions, pretty much walked hand in hand with him. And so that's something that the Serbs have got to grow reconciled to, and their willingness now to put their own war criminals on trial in their own courts and to arrest Karadzic is a very, very important symbolic part of the change, if you like, the normalization, the Europeanization of the Serbian nation.
So, Alan, you're saying then that the new politics of Serbia has really brought this about. Do you have any knowledge through your sources as to how his arrest might have happened?
No, sadly not. I'm speaking to you from the United States, where I'm on holiday. So I haven't, like all the other contributors, really, we only have the slightest snippets of information. It's not even clear, as I understand it, that Serbian police arrested Karadzic. But, it's important, it seems to me, to look again at the role Karadzic played. I used to know him quite well. All of us who covered the breakup of former Yugoslavia had ready access to him. I mean, he used to see us regularly, and what was striking about him was that he saw himself as part of a 19th century epic Serbian tradition of resistance to foreign rule, of fighting the Ottoman Empire, fighting an empire that ceased to exist almost a century before he became an important power broker in the region. And I suppose one of the important things to reflect upon now is who made him the figure that he was. It was partly Milosevic, by handing over a large chunk of the former army of Yugoslavia, the JNA, the Yugoslav People's Army, to his and Mladic's control. But also the international peace brokers, and by the way, with the exception of Paddy Ashdown, who came to Sarajevo with good intentions, trying to make peace, treated Radovan Karadzic as though he were morally equivalent or largely enjoyed the same legitimacy as the president of the Bosnian Republic. This proved a disastrous mistake because it gave him a credibility and an authority that he might otherwise have lacked. And it'll be very interesting to see when he gets into court what he says about the very high-level meetings he had with Western with Western peacemakers.
Alan, given what you've said then about the politics in all this and how important, of course, Europe is now to Serbia, is it, do you think, likely that we'll see Ratko Mladic also captured fairly soon?
Well, we heard Paddy Ashdown there being very optimistic. I don't know. I think when you go to Serbia and to the Serb parts of Bosnia, it's pretty clear that there is a lingering affection and respect for Mladic that Karadzic did not enjoy, certainly not for the last few years. Mladic is the one who really touches the heart and the loyalties of that rump, hardline nationalist constituency that is still there on the fringes of Serbian society. And if Mladic is being protected by them, including presumably rump of the old security, military and intelligence community of Milosevic's Serbia and the old Serbian parts of Bosnia, then that will be a much harder nut to crack than Karadzic, who I think by and large lost a lot of the support he had among the Serbs.
Alan, do you think those hardliners might be in a position to cause any trouble over this, especially if Mladic was likely to be caught?
No, I don't think so. I think that's finished. That's gone. I mean, there were some scare stories in the early part of this year about the Balkans being plunged back into war, back into a regional war, if the West went ahead and recognized Kosovo independence. It didn't materialize. There is no government now anywhere in the region that wants to have a war. That was not true 15 years ago. There were governments in whose interest it was to prosecute war, particularly the government in Serbia. That's simply not true. Wars in the Balkans don't happen by sort of spontaneous eruption. They have to be organized, funded, directed, guided, financed, armed, supplied. Nobody in power in the Balkans wants to do any of that anymore. So I think the prospects for Serbian nationalists to turn this into a casus belli are almost negligible.
The BBC's former correspondent in the Balkans, Alan Little. Many thanks, Alan.
Well, with us now in the studio is the author and journalist Gabriel Partos, who's written extensively about Balkan politics. Good evening to you. Are you surprised by this news?
Not entirely, although most observers would have expected General Mladic, the Bosnian Serbs military commander during the war, to have been captured first. The reason being that he was believed almost certainly to have been hiding in Serbia. Certainly the War Crimes Tribunal in The Hague and its prosecutors have repeatedly said in recent years that he was within the reach of the Serbian authorities, yet he evaded capture, or at least the authorities in Belgrade perhaps were not all that sincere in their attempts to try to capture him. So to that extent it was slightly more surprising that Radovan Karadzic has been now arrested, because for one thing he was believed to have been in hiding not just in Serbia but across the border, the kind of porous border between the Bosnian the Serbian part of Bosnia, Montenegro to the south, and Serbia itself. But clearly the security authorities, the Secret Service in Serbia were aware that he was there, and finally it appears that he was captured by the Serb authorities in Serbia itself.
How do you think that will have happened? Is it simply that somebody, not to put too fine a point on it, will have betrayed him?
Well, we have no details. I certainly am not aware of the background to all this. I think it's in some ways a complex story. I mentioned already that General Mladic has been in Serbia for years, and certainly believed to be within the reach of the authorities there. With Mr. Karadzic, it was more difficult to guess where he was. Secondly, again, while General Mladic had very, very close links with the authorities in Belgrade, going back right to the time of President Milosevic, who of course was the author of the wars in the former Yugoslavia. Radovan Karadzic had in some ways become estranged from President Milosevic in Belgrade. The two of them were not exactly singing from the same hymn tune. There were various personality conflicts between them. Radovan Karadzic at one stage decided he was to become the great leader of all the Serbs, not just in Bosnia itself, where he was their leader, but also across the Serb lands, including Serbia. So there was a lot of rivalry between the two. But General Mladic was more of a military man, and he was more trusted by Milosevic and the rest of the leadership, including the army in Serbia itself.
We'll leave it there. Gabriel Partos, many thanks.
Now we can get more background. Our Belgrade correspondent Helen Fawkes is joining us. Helen, welcome. Maybe you could bring some thoughts on that mixed reception, no doubt, that will be made in Belgrade as to the arrest of Radovan Karadzic.
Well, it's come at a very significant time. It was only a couple of weeks ago that a pro-Western government was formed in Belgrade, and that came after, it came very close that the hardline nationalists were on the verge of forming a government. They failed, and so the pro-Western president, Boris Tadic, was able to form a coalition. But interestingly, he formed a coalition with the socialists. Now, this was the party that was founded by Slobodan Milosevic, and some of those politicians in the socialists are likely to be not very happy with the arrest of Radovan Karadzic. And indeed, there are protesters outside the court in Belgrade, people very angry about this latest development. But I think that on the whole, many people in Serbia will be very happy that this has happened. It will allow the country to move on. But there will be other people who will be very unhappy about this.
And Helen, much speculation as to how the arrests may have come about, and we've been talking about, as you've just been saying there, the politics of all this and how important now the European Union is to Serbia and how Serbia wants to move forward, of course. But have you any views on how Radovan Karadzic may have been arrested?
Well, what the indications from what we're hearing is it could well be that this has happened because of political reasons, not because somebody has stumbled upon him, but that people behind the scenes have created the conditions to allow this to happen. We know that Radovan Karadzic has been protected by a large network of supporters in the past, and that has enabled him to stay hidden and stay away from the UN War Crimes Tribunal, in which he's indicted on very serious war crimes charges. And so it's likely that this has been, for largely political reasons, that this arrest has been able to happen. Serbia has been told in no uncertain terms that unless those indicted by the UN War Crimes Tribunal are arrested and are transferred to The Hague, where the UN's War Crimes Tribunal court is, unless that actually happens, Serbia has little chance of actually becoming a member of the EU. So it's clearly in the pro-Western interest of the government to ensure that those indictees are sent to justice.
And Helen, do you think that amount of pressure is going to be enough, though, to bring about the arrest of Ratko Mladic?
It's unclear, and I think that I would echo what other correspondents have said. This is very interesting. Many analysts that I've spoken to have said that the order in which those remaining indictees are caught, we're likely to see Mladic caught before Karadzic. So it's unclear whether we will see the next arrest, but clearly Serbia will still be under pressure because there are still two people, including Mladic, on the wanted list, and until those men are caught, then the Serbia's European dreams will not be able to be realised.
Our Belgrade correspondent Helen Fawkes reporting there. Many thanks, Helen.
Well, we're looking now at live pictures of the International War Crimes Tribunal at The Hague, and this is where Radovan Karadzic, when he's finally brought to trial now that he's been arrested, will be taken to answer the charges on the UN War Crimes Tribunal indictment. About 2 pages of charges against him and General Ratko Mladic. They're charged with genocide and crimes against humanity, murders, rapes, sexual assault, torture. A great long list of crimes that they will have to answer. Well, let's cross now to Washington and speak to Charles Kupchan, who's the Senior Fellow at the US Council on Foreign Relations. Good evening to you.
Good evening.
What's your reaction to this news?
Well, I think it's long overdue, and on both sides of the Atlantic, people are greeting this arrest with, I think, a great deal of glee, in the sense that Karadzic has been on the run for 13 years. He was, along with Milosevic, one of the masterminds of some of the worst bloodletting that Europe has known since World War II. So this is really, I think, a major step forward in terms of bringing justice to the Balkans and perhaps moving forward the process of reconciliation.
How important is his capture to the politics of the region?
Well, as your correspondent was just saying, I think it's a very good sign about politics in Serbia. When the dust settles and we know exactly what happened today, I think it will probably be clear that this government played an important role in tracking him and making a decision to move forward on the arrest of Karadzic. It's possible that they knew where he was earlier, but the politics weren't right. So this is a sign, I think, that Serbia, under the new government, is heading in the right direction, is still unhappy with the secession of Kosovo from Serbia, but is saying, okay, we don't love this, but we're going to continue working in a pro-EU, pro-Western direction. And then for the other areas, for Kosovo, for Bosnia, for the people that suffered under Karadzic, this is clearly a step forward in trying to put the past behind them.
But aren't there dangers in reviving memories of these terrible crimes?
You know, there are some dangers, and I think in Serbia itself there is still a profound sense of victimization, and some of that will be stoked by the arrest of Karadzic and Mladic, if that is forthcoming in the next weeks or months. But I think on balance, this process of dealing with the past, of holding accountable those charged with war crimes, is the best way to put the Balkans on a trajectory in which, over time, the bloodletting associated with the dissolution of Yugoslavia will be only part of history and not part of the present.
Well, the trial will be about apportioning blame, but are there also unanswered questions?
Well, I think we have a pretty good sense of what happened. There have been a lot of people that have turning over the rocks and the stones in the history of Bosnia, whether it's in Srebrenica, whether it's in Sarajevo or other parts. So I think the key here will not be so much finding new evidence as this making sure that the charges that have been leveled against Karadzic hold up under scrutiny. And if the trial of Milosevic and others is any indication, it would suggest that he will be convicted on at least some of, or if not all of, the charges that have been leveled against him.
How would you sum up Radovan Karadzic?
Well, I would say that he is part of a troika, Milosevic, Karadzic, Mladic, that really were the masterminds, or perhaps the better word would be the architects of really some worst part of Europe's history since the Second World War. We got Mladic now. We also, Karadzic is captured. Milosevic was captured and has passed away. So we've got 2 out of 3. So I do think it's a very important step forward in terms of bringing peace and reconciliation to the Balkans.
Charles Kupchan in Washington, thank you very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Well, Dr. Haris Seladic, who's chairman of the Bosnian presidency, gave this reaction to the news that Radovan Karadzic has been arrested a short time ago.
This is some satisfaction for the families of the victims of Karadzic, Mladic and Milosevic. And this is, of course, good news. But we have to see now that the consequences and the results of the genocide in Bosnia is erased, because there is a part of Bosnia that Karadzic named, and that is called Republika Srpska now, practically devoid of all others but Serbs. Now, Milosevic is dead, Karadzic is arrested, but their project, unfortunately, still lives.
Why do you think it's taken so long to find him?
Well, probably because some people would be embarrassed by whatever Karadzic will now say in the court.
And has that changed?
I'm sorry, I did not hear you well.
But what's changed? Why do you think he's turned up now?
Well, the time has come to do this, and I do not know all the details, but in any case, I will say this again. Now we have to erase the consequences of their deeds. Milosevic is dead, Karadzic is arrested, but they live in what they did in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's still there. Hundreds of thousands of people live outside of Bosnia because of this. The refugees have not returned, but in a very small percent. So we have to do now to do the real justice. And after all, it looks like there is justice in the world.
Now, with us on the line is Clint Williamson. He's the U.S. Ambassador for War Crimes. Ambassador, welcome to BBC News. Perhaps you could just begin by bringing us the U.S. reaction to the arrest of Radovan Karadzic.
We welcome the news of his arrest. I mean, this is a fantastic development. For the last 13 years, my government and European governments and the EU have been working very hard to see that this day arrived. And certainly the International Criminal Tribunal itself has been very involved in these efforts. So, again, it's just a tremendous development.
In terms of putting a line under this whole matter in Bosnia, how important then is his arrest?
I think it's very significant. I was in Srebrenica on July 11th for the commemoration of the genocide that occurred there, and the pain of the victims is still very raw 13 years later. And I think people had grown discouraged and believed that they would never see the day when Karadzic and Mladic were brought to justice. So it is a huge development. It is going to be crucial for reconciliation in the region. It helps us move away from the collectivization of guilt, and holding those people who were personally responsible for this in court is going to be critical.
Ambassador, you have been a trial prosecutor, of course, at The Hague. Perhaps you could just take us through the process now and what is likely to happen to Karadzic over the coming days.
Well, I think right now most of what's going to happen is going to play out in Belgrade. He will likely appear in court in the next day or so. There will be a verification of his identity. Once that is accomplished, then things should move relatively quickly for his transfer to The Hague. Once he arrives in The Hague, he will go in and do an initial appearance, at which time the charges will be read against him, and then he will be asked to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. Presumably, he would enter a plea of not guilty, and then a trial process would begin at some point in the future.
And do you think now that we've seen his arrest, and because of how important the politics, how they're playing out in all this, with Serbia, of course, wanting to be very much a part of the European Union, do you think we are closer to the arrest, to capturing Ratko Mladic?
I think Ratko Mladic is a very nervous man this evening. Clearly, the change in government has produced significant changes on the ground on this issue. President Tadic, to his credit, has said repeatedly that he wanted to get this issue behind Serbia, that he wanted to see this arrest occur. So I think once a government was put in place that he controlled and was able to do this, they moved very quickly to accomplish it.
And do you think, because of the pressure that's been put on Serbia, because of what the European Union largely has been saying about their admission to the European Union, Serbia that is, do you think that pressure has brought all this about?
I think it's played a huge part in it, absolutely. There has been a united position in the West over the years, going back to 1995, that Serbia had to cooperate with the tribunal. All of the fugitives have been arrested now, but for two others. Ratko Mladic, of course, who is equally notorious with Radovan Karadzic, and then Goran Hadžić, who was a leader of the Croatian Serbs. But I think all of this pressure over time has produced the result that we've seen today. Combined, obviously, with a government in Belgrade that has been willing to do the right thing.
And then just briefly, finally, I don't know if you can give us an idea of the timescale of this now, how long it will take before that we would see Radovan Karadzic before the International War Crimes Tribunal.